going to just go ahead and dive in and start explaining that concept, Jonathan.
That's a big part of how Wall Street's been running us into a ditch for the last 30 years.
The debt ceiling is not some sort of macroeconomic concept.
The U.S. isn't really a great place, and it's not really the land of the free.
Get 1,000 people together and let's go lay siege to City Hall.
Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We have a fantastic show for you, as always. Want to start with the RP plugs, and I also want to apologize again that the show's a little bit later than usual. You guys, I'm hoping to get back to the earlier time slot as soon as I possibly can, but I appreciate you all tuning in when I can make it. As always, go to realprogressives.org to learn more about us or contribute. realprogressives.org/donate if you'd like to help us out. We are a nonprofit, and we appreciate any and all help that you can provide. Also, all sorts of fantastic content over at realprogressives.org and on this YouTube channel, as well as our Real Progressives YouTube channel. Don't miss Steve Grumbine's, our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine's Macro and Cheese podcast, or his Rogue Scholar clips that we post here throughout the week. Don't miss Joy's show, Joy and Andrew, on Monday nights. We have all sorts of fantastic articles on the website. Make sure you're not missing any of our content, realprogressives.org and realprogressives.org/donate if you'd like to help us out. So, obviously, big story was the student debt cancellation that Biden engaged in, the small amounts of student debt cancellation. I have a whole lot of things to say about this, you guys, from the policy of it to the politics of it to, kind of all angles of it. I do want to actually start here with a tweet that I think does a good job of giving some flowers where they are due. This is Barbarism Critic, who says, "It's not enough, leaves way too many people out, and we have to push for more, but activists deserve their flowers today. This never would have happened. 20 million people would not have had their debt wiped out if activists weren't relentless fighters on this subject." You guys, I want to remind you the White House spent a year and a half lying to us, saying that they could not do this, and the obvious reason for them doing that, especially looking back in hindsight, having their lies proven by themselves to have been lies, I think that it's important to recognize that the relentless pressure referenced in that tweet is obviously what got anything done here, right? So obviously we're going to get into how inadequate it is and how stupid politically it is to only do this minuscule measure when you could go all the way and you have no reason not to. But I do want to give props to the activists who refused to shut up when the Democrats spent a year and a half brazenly lying to you, telling you that we can't do this without Congress. So we'll start there, and now we'll kind of get into some of the policy specifics. I have an article here in The Intercept that goes into the origin of student debt, which obviously has some it's very revealing in terms of what student debt has evolved to become. This is by John Schwarz. "The origin of student debt. Reagan advisor warned free college would create a dangerous educated proletariat." In 1970, Roger Freeman, who also worked for Nixon, revealed the right's motivation for coming decades of attacks on higher education. With the vociferous debate about Joe Biden's announcement that the federal government will cancel a portion of outstanding student debt, it's important to understand how Americans came to owe the current cumulative total of more than $1.6 trillion for higher education. In 1970, Ronald Reagan was running for re-election as governor of California. He had first won in 1966 with confrontational rhetoric toward the University of California public college system and executed confrontational policies when in office. In May 1970, Reagan had shut down all 28 UC and Cal State campuses in the midst of student protests against the Vietnam War and the U.S. bombing of Cambodia. On October 29th, less than a week before the election, his education advisor Roger Freeman spoke at a press conference to defend him. Freeman's remarks were reported the next day in the San Francisco Chronicle under the headline, "Professor Sees Peril in Education." According to the Chronicle article, Freeman said, quote, "We are in danger of producing an educated proletariat. That's dynamite. We have to be selective on who we allow to go to college. If not," Freeman continued, "we will have a large number of highly trained and unemployed people," Freeman also said, taking a highly idiosyncratic perspective on the cause of fascism. Quote, "That's what happened in Germany. I saw it happen." Okay. I'm not even going to dignify the last point with a response. Obviously, overeducation is not the cause of fascism. What an absolutely moronic and absurd thing to say. But the reasons given there by Freeman for the initial classist policies on secondary education are really do kind of elucidate the actual feelings of the elites and the actual root of the policy that we have now had to live under for decades, why it was actually there and what it was intended to do. Well, it succeeded in that regard, didn't it? Certainly constrained access to education to the wealthy, and the only way around that for so many people was to saddle themselves with crippling debt. And now the conservatives, the same conservatives who would have supported this policy, are now arguing against canceling or forgiving that debt for obviously the same reasons. I want to show you guys a couple clips here. This is Brianna Joy Gray. I'm sure many of you know her. She was Bernie's press secretary. She now does the Bad Faith podcast. And she also sometimes hosts Rising on the Hill. She did a couple of monologues on this, and I want to show you small portions of each. I just think she kind of makes the case very clearly and responds to some of the very disingenuous criticisms that we tend to see coming from the right against canceling student debt. So this is Brianna Joy Gray on the Hill talking about student debt.
Only has the executive authority to cancel one type of debt. I wish it weren't the case, but that's true. He can only cancel student debt right now. And running cover for the Biden administration and the big banks who pay him doesn't make you a working class hero. Hold the Springsteen tracks. Running cover for the senator from MBNA is the most elite of elite behavior, no matter how much you want to dress it up as a working class issue. The only question you have to ask yourself is this. A rich person and a poor person each have a child with great grades and an interest in being a doctor or a nurse or a teacher. Should the ability of the student and their interest drive whether they get to go to college or go on to medical school? Or should their parents' income determine that? Rich gatekeepers are paying millions of dollars to make sure America's students aren't bailed out, but Kanye, Kushner, and Paul Pelosi are. It's corruption, plain and simple. And with your help, it looks like elites are going to get away with it again.
Something to quibble with. I'm not sure that this policy is as popular as you're making it out to be. It matters how it's asked. Like I just Googled it, and you could. So 59% of Americans are worried student loan forgiveness will make inflation worse, for instance. Which I
wonder why they think that, Robbie.
Because it probably will make inflation
All right,
worse.
so where was this conversation in these polls when the PPP loans were being forgiven without fanfare earlier this year?
Yeah, we shouldn't. I don't want to forgive any of those other things either. Look, I take your point on the bailouts. It's hypocritical. I agree with you on all that. All of these wealthy people seek bailouts and
get bailouts.
And they get them. So yes, I get that. Look, I feel badly for young people who took on this debt. It was a really bad idea.
Old people.
And nobody made them do it, though.
No, but Robbie,
you make an agreement.
That's not true, Robbie. The government, and you maybe are a little too young to remember this, but in the 80s, 90s, and early aughts, right up through Barack Obama, the rhetoric was clear. If you are poor, if you are from an underadvantaged community, if you are black, if you are brown, if you have low educational attainment, it's your fault. It's not the government's fault. You need to go to college.
So wonderful job of making the case there, and a perfect response to Robbie's nonsense. And I couldn't help but cackle a little bit at her. You might be too young to remember, and then the look on his face, that was hilarious. Great job from Brianna. But yeah, of course, you guys. I was part of the generation that was essentially raised being told by absolutely every authority figure that I ever interacted with, you need to go to college. That's the key to success. If you want to be able to sustain yourself economically, you need to go to college. This is what an entire, more than an entire generation has been told. So you can't turn around and say, well, you accepted the debt, and you can't turn around and complain that it's predatory now. I think that's an absurd argument on the surface. You can't just tell people you must do X to succeed and then blame them for doing X. I think it's absurd, and a great job there of shutting down that argument from Brianna. And also, I just want to note there's a little bit of a trend here when you do good policy, you sometimes like force conservatives into accidentally agreeing with good policy. And I have seen a number of conservatives say, well, actually, I think the PPP loan forgiveness was like a bad thing. So you back them into a corner with these hypocrisies, and sometimes they will actually concede certain points. You got Marco Rubio going on cable news arguing for like, we need to fix the root of the problem, the predatory loans and the for-profit system for college. Marco fucking Rubio. So he's doing that as like a criticism of Biden not fixing the root of the problem and putting a Band-Aid on it instead. Okay, Marco, I actually agree with you for once, but notice how you've been treated. You've basically become a puppet for the left because there's actually good policy being implemented here. So one nice byproduct of actually doing good things that help working class people is you sometimes force your enemy into a corner in other aspects of that policy, if that kind of makes sense. If I feel like I said that really shittily, but I hope you guys kind of know what I mean. And that becomes a little bit of a trend as we look at this student debt thing. Anyway, we have one more clip here of Brianna Joy Gray, and then we will come back and discuss. Oh, here we go.
COVID relief unexpectedly empowered labor, and now elites are trying to put a lid on it in whatever way they can, restarting student loan payments, canceling support for families with children, and intentionally driving up unemployment. We need to recognize this and use the student debt victory to continue to pull together as a community of working people and keep demanding more. In the richest country in the history of the world, education should be free. Yes, even for rich kids, just like public high school is free for the rich should they choose to attend. And I gotta say, I think rich people would be better people if they did attend public high schools. And just like libraries are free for the rich and services of firefighters, it's our country, and we get to make it work for us. Let's follow through on legitimate concerns that student debt relief is only a partial solution and finish the job. Let's make America great again by establishing a well-educated, able workforce, one we can be proud of, one that can build semiconductors and make doctors and plumbers and invent medicines and fix our roads and bridges and create clean energy solutions, one that can compete on a global stage without relying on the power of American imperialism. I truly believe we can do all that, and I believe that free public college is a solid first step. So what do you think, Robbie? Have I addressed some of your concerns that you raised yesterday?
Look, I appreciate the point you made in the middle of your radar that and that you support changes to the system, because that's really where I'm coming from. I don't understand how this can be done with, and I listened to Biden's remarks yesterday where he talks about how he speaks eloquently about how people are mired in this debt. They're drowning. They were swindled. They were scammed. They can't get out of it. Okay, fine. But how can we do this without fixing any of the underlying incentives that, like, shouldn't we end the scam? The scam being this subsidized student loan process that the government does. It's a government policy. The government could just end it.
Yeah.
If it's so vicious, if it's such a swindle, we should stop doing the swindle.
You guys see what I mean? Brianna's sitting there going, yeah, I agree. I think sometimes you can back them into a corner when you simply execute good policy. They're arguing for a more progressive policy than Joe Biden actually went with here. So, and obviously there are all sorts of, I think, political issues with how that plays. There's the obvious sort of like on the surface take that it's positive politically because you are helping tens of millions of people in a pretty direct, tangible way. But there's a couple of other takes for me, and perhaps this is a little bit too sophisticated for a large portion of the voting public, and I don't mean that quite as condescendingly as it might have come off, but I think people tend to look at the surface level stuff and not go a little deeper. But Democrats basically admitted they were lying for a year and a half by doing this, right? So there's part of this that's kind of like, so wait a minute, what's been the story for a year and a half? Why didn't you just do this earlier? And the other thing is, I think the timing of it to most people will probably, at least to me, it seems very obviously aimed at helping them in the primaries. So instead of doing this right off the bat, and then maybe the sort of the excitement and the media coverage and this and that and the positive feelings for Democrats from this policy wears off, right? Instead, they choose to do it right before the primary. I think there's some political cynicism there that, you know, is pretty easy to recognize. So I think there are a couple of ways in which this policy, you know, does kind of backfire if you think it through. But I think on the by and large, you're like directly improving the financial situation for tens of millions of people, and that hardly can help you or hardly can hurt you in an election in most cases. The other thing, though, you guys, like by doing 10 and 20 and this sort of means-tested, very convoluted bill that they decided to go with, or executive order that they decided to go with, it also reveals that you could have just canceled it all. Because the only reason you have refused thus far to cancel it all is you said you couldn't do what you've just done. So it also reveals not just that you've been lying for a year and a half, but that you could have done substantially more and chose not to, right? There's no one the Democrats can like hide behind when they've done a portion of this. They can't say, well, the parliamentarian, or well, we'd have to go through Congress and Joe Manchin, and you know, so if you go the layer deeper, I think there are a number of ways in which voters might find this kind of distasteful just in the specifics. But on the by and large, of course, you guys, forgiving debt for tens of millions of people is going to help you in an election, and I think that's probably what drove the timing of this. So all sorts of political implications here. It looks like I've been getting up here. Anyone who's listened to me regularly for the last year and however long I've been here at RP, I've been predicting, as I think was kind of universally expected, that the Republicans would absolutely mollywop the Democrats this November. That's looking more and more in doubt based upon some of the results that we've seen thus far. I still think it's a pretty favorable environment for Republicans, but I think that the Dobbs decision will backfire substantially on Republicans and might have handed Democrats a gift. And I think this student debt thing is obviously timed such that that Democrats are trying to benefit from it in a political sense. And also the Inflation Reduction Act, as it's fucking called, which really is not a good bill at all. It's maybe marginally reducing emissions, maybe. But I think the timing of that, because so many people base their political analysis on sort of how the media presents it, I think the timing of that is also kind of, driven towards helping the Democrats in the primary. A lot of people in D.C. seem to think that just passing anything is like a political win, and that'll get you media credit, and that'll, make voters think that you can get things done. And so I think the Democrats are obviously here trying to avoid the situation that looked pretty obvious for a long time, which was that they were going to get destroyed this November. So there's all sorts of political implications to this, obviously, you guys. You also kind of piss off the people that are making, $126 a year or whatever, right? Not that that's a very large portion of the voting public that's kind of right there on the margin. But when you means test something, you piss people off who are right over that margin and otherwise would have seen some forgiveness. I will say, I think that even more important than the 10 or 20,000, I think that the caps on payment are a step in the right direction. Instead of having to pay 10% of your monthly income for a graduate degree loan, you now have to pay 5%. That is pretty substantial for a lot of people, and obviously, I want to be very clear. I'm for canceling all of it, and all of this is inadequate in that context. But that is an important one, and also the 10-year cap on how long you have to pay loans. Previously, to my understanding, was 20. So there's marginal improvements here. This is what Democrats do, you guys. When they have power to do a good thing, they do like 10% of the good thing, and then they expect to be given credit for it. So I am thrilled for the tens of millions of people who will see substantial relief from this. I really sincerely am. I would rather see that happen than not. I'm glad to see those caps happen as opposed to them not. But it's obvious that the Democrats had the power to do substantially more here and chose not to. And I think that we also need to continue the pressure that has forced their hand this far, right? So again, props to the activists who would not shut up about this and kept this a prominent issue even as the Biden administration and other Democrats tried to tell us that we couldn't get it. And I hope that pressure will continue. Now, there is obviously also the economics of this, which have been grossly misrepresented by many different political factions, in my opinion. I have a couple of things to show you guys about. Oops. Here we go. A couple of things to show you guys about that. This is Ramona Masacci. Some of you may recognize her. She did some interviews with me of people running for Congress. Go give her a follow at Ramona Masacci if you're not following her. She says, the best thing that happened yesterday was not just getting some student loans canceled. It was everyone starting to question, where does money come from? How does the federal government create a policy that doesn't fall on the taxpayers' shoulders? This would be a good time for Bernie Sanders and friends to have an online discussion with Stephanie Kelton nationally about the taxpayer myth. Maybe John Yarmuth could lead it since he has nothing to lose. For those that don't know what she's referencing there, John Yarmuth is a member of the House who was chair of the Budget Committee and is retiring. So there's really no more threat the establishment can hold over his head. He came out publicly on C-SPAN and talked about MMT and encouraged people to read Stephanie's book. If you have not read The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, I really recommend it. I also, once again, recommend realprogressives.org. We have all sorts of material on MMT. It's really important to understand how the federal finance system works, and I think Ramona is spot on there, that this did spark that discussion and that question of, well, who paid for the canceled debt? So obviously it's already on the ledger as it is, right? But these were federal loans, so that is public money that paid for those loans to start with, and now we're canceling them. If you don't understand where public money comes from, please, again, The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton and realprogressives.org for all sorts of MMT content. It's really important to understand that money is created when spent and eliminated when taxed. It is not the other way around. A lot of people seem to think that your hard-earned tax dollars are paying for things at the federal level. They are not in a functional sense. There are all sorts of reasons to tax, but none of them have anything to do with financing your spending at the federal level. And I think I agree with Ramona. I think it's very important that conversation be had, and I hope that policies like this continue to spark that conversation. To get into some of the specifics that I kind of started to dabble into there a little bit, this is from our founder and CEO, Steve. If you're not following him, at SD Grumbine on Twitter. For anyone looking at where does the money come from on the minuscule student debt point-shaving experiment, no money was created. The institutions were already paid. A government-backed debt was simply no longer pursued for $10,000, nothing more than a ledger entry, negative $10,000. The federal government held the debt. However, we know your hero POTUS, he obviously means that facetiously, made discharging student debt through bankruptcy impossible, and he also made regular bankruptcy more challenging for people to discharge as well. That is very different than medical debt, which can be discharged. So what happens when folks come demanding reparations? Did folks learn about how federal finance works? Do they understand how to fight for their cause? How about National Improved Medicare for All? Did anyone actually address the funding mechanism so people get it? It seems like the funding mechanism should be thoroughly understood so that this shitty pittance of a $10,000 debt cancellation is a total waste and can help discharge the remaining massive debt burden still hung on the necks of millions of people guilty of pursuing an education. Without a thorough understanding that the federal government is the currency issuer and therefore has the power to do anything whatsoever, it has the ability to purchase in U.S. dollars, and the available resources are available for purchase, either public purchase or private. For too long, we skip this part, and the main outcry, other than fairness, is people are concerned they are paying taxes to cover someone else's education. This simply isn't how it works. Federal taxes do not fund federal spending. There is only public money, never taxpayer dollars. So I think this does create a very nice opportunity for us to kind of make our pitch as to why MMT is so fucking important. You guys, you've all been out there and seen the arguments coming from the right? They're all trying to say, like, listen, your average middle class, working class person is having to pay taxes for the elite who went to college. You see these arguments, right? And we know they're disingenuous for a myriad of reasons. Many people do point out the hypocrisies there. Many people point out that the wealthiest of the wealthy obviously do not have to take out loans to go to college. Why would you take out a loan and pay interest when you could just cover it up front, you guys? The wealthy, the uber wealthy don't have these loans. There are a myriad of hypocrisies that we could point out. But one of them is that they are simply functionally incorrect. Those working class people are not paying for the cancellation of this debt in any sense at all. It's the public. It's the federal government. It is not your hard-earned tax dollars. That argument goes out the window the moment that we all understand MMT, and that is why it is so important, you guys. You can pick your policy. Pick a handful of them that are most important to you, as I presume mostly lefties in my audience. Pick a handful of them and list them in your head. All of them likely require some form of spending, right? What's the only effective argument against the policies you're thinking of? How are you going to pay for it? This is why it's so important for the public to understand MMT. It would totally disarm the right from their thoroughly disingenuous arguments about pay-fors, okay? So great thread there from Steve, and a great point from Ramona that this is a positive outcome of these kinds of policies. And, you know, that's very important to understand the MMT stuff. Another hypocrisy here that we're going to get into a little bit, this is a tweet thread from Dean Baker. This one also got some coverage, and I'm sure many of you know a little bit about this. We actually talked a little bit about this last week. He says, fun with numbers. For those upset that Biden's loan forgiveness helps some better off people, let's think about what Senator Sinema did for boys and girls who run hedge funds. Let's say that the hedge fund partners may get paid $2.5 million. That takes the form of carried interest. If we didn't give special tax treatment for hedge fund and private equity partners, everything over $520,000 would be taxed at a 37% rate. Thanks to Senator Sinema's hard work, their pay is only taxed at the 20% capital gains rate. Taxed at the normal rate, the 37% on everything over $500,000 would mean roughly $740,000 in taxes. However, Senator Sinema's special treatment for hedge fund and private equity partners measure means they will only pay $400,000 in taxes. That's $340K in savings. The difference is $340K, or 34 times the student loan debt forgiveness that has gotten the pundits up in arms about helping better off people. And this tax giveaway to the private equity and hedge fund partners is an annual occurrence, not a one-time deal. Also, many of them would have far more than $2.5 million of their salary in carried interest. So, obviously, we covered the Inflation Reduction Act, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, and how Sinema and Manchin were able to slip in their goodies for the fossil fuel industry and for private equity. Dean doing a great job there to bring attention to the massive hypocrisy in the press, hand-wringing about $10K in cancellation for some better-off people, which, by the way, you guys, I don't remember if I brought this up. I don't think I did. Damn it. I meant to. First of all, 40% of people who have student debt did not get their degree. It is not an elite group when we're talking about student debtors. And the second point is, and I really wish I brought this article up so I could cite it for you guys, but 90% of student debt is held by people who make $75,000 a year or less. So, no, it's not the wealthy elites who are being forgiven here on the by and large. And obviously, when we're talking about public policy, like Brianna mentioned in one of those clips, this is like public high school, you guys. I don't want a billionaire's kid not to have access to public high school. And as Brianna points out, maybe some of their kids would be better fucking people if they went to public high school. So the separation between middle school and high school and then college has always been very odd and very arbitrary to me. We accept that these public institutions should service the entire general public up until you're 18. It's just it's arbitrary and it's odd. Do we value education or do we not? It's really that simple. Now, of course, you can make the argument that public school has been supported more because it provides essential daycare for parents who capitalists need to be at work. And I think there's probably some validity to that argument that once they're 18, the capitalists say, kick them to the streets and come into work. We no longer have any interest in this, right? But from a public policy perspective, it's always seemed odd to me that we just sort of, college is different, right? And, of course, you guys, it's massively hypocritical for conservatives of all people who have dedicated their entire careers to serving these wealthy people to turn around and try to say, well, your policy helps the wealthy. Excuse me? Excuse me? I mean, that part's, so again, hypocrisy is just fucking all over the place here. Another angle in all of this that I wanted to make sure to draw to your attention. This is Nina Turner. She tweets, canceling $10,000 in student debt when the average white borrower is $12,000 in debt and black women hold an average over $52,000 isn't just unacceptable, it's structural racism. Obviously, as with many aspects of our society, there are racial discrepancies in terms of how badly this system harms different groups of people. Black women averaging over $52,000 in debt, you guys. So 10, even if they're Pell recipients and they get 20, for many people, the number that they owe goes up, not down, even when they're making payments because of the compounding interest. So for a lot of these people, 10 or 20 is it's not materially changing your financial situation. Certainly not for the near future. So I think that's worth pointing out, and that's an angle to all of this as well. We have a tweet here from the Gravel Institute. I'm sure some of you have seen the absurdity that Jason Furman has decided to spew all over online for the ever since this passed. He says pouring roughly $500 billion of gasoline on the inflationary fire that is already burning is reckless. Doing it while going well beyond one campaign promise, $10,000 of student loan relief, and breaking another, all proposals paid for, is even worse. Gravel Institute handles this quite nicely. They say this was Obama's chief economic advisor, in case you're wondering why the post-2008 recovery was such a disaster. That kind of sums it up. The economists have revealed themselves and told on themselves in response to this policy, you guys. The same people who have nothing to say about corporate price gouging and market manipulation seem to think that everyone needs to be saddled. Again, 90% of whom are making less than $75,000 a year. They need to be saddled with crippling debt for the economy, for the sake of avoiding inflation. But we're going to ignore the primary causes of inflation. Once again, a reason that it's very important to have at least a rudimentary understanding of macroeconomics. And we also have Jim Banks here, who just completely, said the quiet part out loud about one of the main reasons that the establishment has pushed back against free college and loan forgiveness. Jim Banks says, student loan forgiveness undermines one of our military's greatest recruitment tools at a time of dangerously low enlistments. We can't exploit poor kids into getting limbs blown off and coming back with PTSD anymore because you're offering them an education. Can you even imagine making that argument? Can you even, honestly, how do you lay your head on the pillow at night, Jim? Utterly absurd. We'd like for you to go commit war crimes, but we no longer have the leverage to exploit you into going and committing war crimes on behalf of imperialism and the military-industrial complex. So we can't make college free. We can't forgive this debt. Can you even imagine? But saying the quiet part out loud, and that obviously is, you guys, a serious pressure in terms of the establishment's thought process on this policy. So. And lastly, at least lastly on student debt anyway, I often, think that the Biden administration has been, and really Democrats for decades, have been historically bad communicators and really, really bad about selling policies and responding to criticisms. They always go all tepid and they always are on the defense. They never seem to go on the attack. So just purely from a political strategy kind of point of view, I have been kind of impressed by how they've responded to the Republicans on this. And I wanted to show you guys this thread. This is the right way to respond to hypocrisies and disingenuous criticism. Marjorie Taylor Greene says, for our government just to say, okay, your debt is completely forgiven, it's completely unfair. The White House retweets this and says, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene had $183,504 in PPP loans forgiven. Here we have Vern Buchanan. They say Congressman Vern Buchanan had over $2.3 million in PPP loans forgiven. Marquane Mullen. Congressman, Marquane Mullen had over $1.4 million in PPP loans forgiven. Kevin Hearn had over 1 million in PPP loans forgiven. Mike Kelly, $987,237 in PPP loans forgiven. Matt Gates, 482 grand forgiven. That is, you guys, how to respond. The Democrats are often far too tepid to go on the offense and, call out the hypocrisies that Republicans embrace. So, lots to condemn about this policy. I simply do not understand not just canceling all of it. I do not understand any arguments against that. Obviously, I do agree with the conservative pushback in the sense that, yeah, we should solve the root problems. We should make college free, and we should disallow predatory financial institutions from trying to profit off of it and trying to saddle, 18-year-olds with lifelong debt. Of course we should fix those problems. 100% agree. So there's a lot of issues with this bill. It doesn't go nearly far enough, but I do sincerely want to give props to the activists who pushed to make this much happen. I hope that we will continue to push. Not that I expect any more to come, but this is good for tens of millions of people, and I am grateful that those people have a financially better situation today than they did a week ago, right? So we have a labor update to bring you guys like I try to do every week, and this one starts with kind of one close to my heart in a sense. This is Lauren Kaori Gurley, who tweets, inbox, delivery drivers at Seattle sandwich company Homegrown who are unionizing gained the right to block driver-facing surveillance cameras after going on strike last week. I actually worked at a Homegrown something like, 8, 9, 10 years ago, something like that. The store that I worked at is now closed. It was in Sammamish, but I made sandwiches at Homegrown for a while. Many aspects of the company are actually kind of great. They prioritize being as sustainable as possible for the environment, and they prioritize organic and locally sourced foods and things like that. But they were apparently mistreating their delivery drivers as the business grew, and these drivers pushed back. And this was essentially cameras being put in their delivery vans, and the unionized drivers or unionizing, drivers pushed back and won a ruling that said they can basically cover those cameras and not be surveyed by their employers. So wonderful win there. Great to see that kind of happening in my neck of the woods. And also, you guys, I wanted to, Lauren Kaori Gurley, all over labor issues. If you're not following her, at Lauren K. Gurley on Twitter, always reporting on these sorts of issues. And as I've discussed ad nauseum, I think they're very important to discuss. This is More Perfect Union, another one that you should follow at More Perfect US if you're not already. Breaking: Chipotle workers in Lansing, Michigan have won their historic union election. They've formed the first ever unionized Chipotle in the country with Teamsters. Chipotle has waged war against its unionizing stores. Executives shut down an Augusta, Maine, is that Maine, ME? Yeah, location that was the first store to file to form a union. Workers in Lansing overcame this egregious union busting to form the first ever Chipotle union. Wonderful to see. The wave continues, you guys. Starbucks, Amazon, it's great to see it expanding and continuing. Congratulations to these Chipotle workers. Another More Perfect Union, REI workers voted to unionize their store in Berkeley, California. They organized with UFCW and are now the second unionized REI store in the country, following Reunion Soho's victory. REI Union Soho's victory in New York in March. So wonderful to see that as well. Retail workers joining the fight and joining the wave. And then we also have an update here on Starbucks, also courtesy of More Perfect Union. The NLRB has ruled that Starbucks illegally withheld pay benefits from workers at hundreds of unionizing stores. It's now moving to force Starbucks to pay back 100% of the denied benefits, require Howard Schultz to record a video admitting the illegal action. The NLRB is also requiring Starbucks to order all managers and supervisors to attend a labor law and worker rights training, issue a letter of apology to all Starbucks employees for the hardship caused. SB Workers United shared this reaction to the NLRB ruling. Quote, Howard Schultz made the decision to deprive us of a raise in a time where the cost of living is skyrocketing. He claims to run a different kind of company, yet in reality, Howard Schultz is simply a billionaire bully who is doing everything he can to crush workers' rights, said Maggie Carter, a barista from Knoxville, Tennessee. This NLRB decision is historic. I look forward to the day Howard Schultz must apologize to us for violating our rights and provide the benefits he so callously denied us. Starbucks spent months telling workers that they wouldn't get pay raises and benefits if they unionized. The goal was clear: scare them out of organizing. SB Workers United waived the right to negotiate over the raise. Waived the right to negotiate over the raise. Now the NLRB says Starbucks is obligated to pay up. Update: the NLRB issued its complaint against Starbucks in Region 19. NLRB General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo will prosecute Starbucks for illegally withholding pay raises. That's huge. This will be in court on October 25th. So, great to see the largely gutted NLRB pushing back here and continuing to push back against Starbucks' illegal union-busting tactics. I did just learn, just the other day, that one of Bernie's top staffers, I guess, went to the NLRB or to the Labor Department, so that may have something to do with it, but the NLRB has actually seemed willing to push back against Starbucks here in a way that's much more robust than they usually do, and as we've covered quite a bit in the past, Starbucks and Amazon both engaging in historic anti-union activities and illegal activities to try to break up those organizing efforts. So congratulations to all of the workers at the various companies. I encourage you all, as always, to support your local workers and do not cross those picket lines, and whatever you can do to support striking workers, unionizing workers, workers that are walking out, anything going on in the labor sector, I encourage you all to stand with workers in your community to the best degree that you can. Rather insane story here. This is in The Intercept, and the capitalists keep just kind of admitting the quiet parts out loud. This by Ken Klippenstein and John Schwarz. Real estate CEO: recession could be good if unemployment puts employers back in the driver's seat. The executive told Wall Street analysts that joblessness could help companies bring people back in the office where they want them. The CEO and president of Douglas Emmett Incorporated, a real estate corporation worth over $3 billion, and based in Santa Monica, California, said on an August 2nd corporate earnings call that a recession could be good for the commercial real estate business if it comes with a level of unemployment that puts employers back in the driver's seat and allows them to get all their employees back into the office. The executive, Jordan Kaplan, then repeated that the thought would be that unemployment would be up, and therefore employers would be in the driver's seat to bring people back in the office, which is where they want them. Rather than that, Kaplan added, I would not be pleased to have us going into a recession. He noted that recessions are a revenue-hitting activity. And if my tenants are feeling the impact of recession, then I can't imagine how I think that's good. Oh my God. Revenue-hitting activity. Recessions aren't bad because it's catastrophic for millions of workers who have their livelihood, severely attacked. Recessions are bad because it's a revenue-constraining activity. That's why. Boy, they are just so comfortable saying these quiet parts out loud, you guys. And I think that's what's really absurd to me. Obviously we all expect and understand that this incentive structure exists and that these, executives and shareholders and board members of these corporations are going to feel this way. We all kind of accept and understand that, right? Accept's the wrong word, but we, accept it as reality, I should say. What kind of continually blows my mind is just how comfortable they are just publicly saying this kind of shit, where they know that the press is going to be able to get their hands on it and report on it. And they still just say, recession could be good for us. Could be good for us. It's a condemnation on our entire society that those people can go out to a polite dinner after that. It really sincerely is, you guys. I know there was lots of debate about Supreme Court justices and politicians and when you should and shouldn't protest them. They should not be comfortable when they are treating us how they're treating us. They shouldn't be comfortable. So, same with these CEOs who are willing to say these kinds of outrageous things. recession equals good for the real estate industry. Absurd, ridiculous. And kind of along those same lines, I'm sure that some of you saw that Jerome Powell made some statements about their attempts to combat inflation. And we've covered quite a bit that there is no evidence that raising interest rates actually does combat inflation. But setting that aside, there is one thing that we know these actions will do. And the Fed is, again, trying to kind of tap dance how they're saying that. This is Jordan Sheridan retweeting it. So I'll start with the original quote from Jerome Powell. He says, while higher interest rates, slower growth, and softer labor market conditions will bring down inflation, they will also bring some pain to households and businesses. These are the unfortunate costs of reducing inflation. You guys understand what that means, right? You all have to take a hit. Not the wealthy. You all have to take a hit. Jordan retweets this and says, translated from Federal Reserve Chair, we're going to facilitate millions of people losing their jobs rather than do something about criminal corporate price gouging, the real driver of inflation. I cannot emphasize this tweet enough. If I could retweet it 1,000,000 times, I fucking would. Corporate market manipulation and price gouging is the primary driver of this inflation, and anyone who ignores that in their analysis in order to attack working people or attack student debtors or any of those other groups, right, that are not responsible for this, nor are they benefiting from this like the corporations are, I think is being completely disingenuous in their analysis, and I don't think should be taken seriously. Great job by Jordan there of pointing that out. Jerome Powell basically telling working class people to get shafted so that we can fix the inflation that has nothing to do with them working. Nothing to do with anything that they are doing, and everything to do with corporate greed. All right, guys, so we have some climate crisis stuff to cover. A few negative pieces, and then I did manage to find a positive climate piece to bring you all. So we'll get to that in just a few here, but first we got to get through historic droughts and other climate catastrophes. We'll start here with a piece in Reuters by Emma Farge. Horn of Africa on track for 5th failed rainy season, according to the WMO. The worst drought in the Horn of Africa in more than 40 years looks almost certain to persist after the World Meteorological Organization said on Friday that forecasts for October-December show a high chance of drier than average conditions. The latest outlook confirms the fears of aid agencies, which have been warning for months about the worsening consequences of the drought for Ethiopia, Somalia, and parts of Kenya, including a risk of another famine in Somalia following one there a decade ago that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Quote, sadly, our models show with a high degree of confidence that we are entering the 5th consecutive failed rainy season in the Horn of Africa, says Ghalid Artan, director of the IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center, the WMO's Regional Climate Center for East Africa. Quote, in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, we are on the brink of an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, he added. The drought has coincided with a global rise in food and fuel prices, pushed up by the war in Ukraine that has hit parts of Africa hardest. The World Health Organization says over 80 million people in the 7 countries spanning the region, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda, are estimated to be food insecure. So we are seeing the results of the climate crisis. I also just want to briefly say the way that Reuters presents inflation there is, as we literally just covered, completely and totally incorrect, and they should be ashamed to do so as a trusted journalistic outlet. If you don't mention corporate price gouging when you talk about inflation and you instead decide to blame it on other things, you are completely lying to your readers. But this drought, absolutely catastrophic, 5th year in a row, and leading to famine in, I believe they said, 7 different countries in East Africa. So more results of the climate catastrophe that we have created. Another drought going on in China. This also Reuters, Thomas Peter, and oh boy, you guys, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name. I am so sorry. Chinese drillers work 15-hour days building wells in drought-hit Jiangxi. Teams of drillers are working long hours to build wells to fight a devastating drought sweeping parts of China. Farmers in Zhujiang City in the country's central Jiangxi province told Reuters on Saturday. Quote, "These villages, all of them are particularly dry," said Gao Pucha, 42, who led one drilling team in Dashan village in Zhujiang. "When we got the notice to drill wells, we got up early and worked late, more than 15 hours a day." In another nearby village, a 72-year-old man, surnamed Chen, scored the fields for ears of rice left over from the paddy harvester to take home and feed to his chickens. Quote, "Sesame, corn, sweet potatoes, cotton in the dry lands are all dried up," Chen told Reuters. Chen added that only the rice fields could be filled with water from nearby reservoirs, so they've just filled them with a little bit of water, and it was a little bit better. So crops going dry in China, they're forced to dig wells to deal with this drought. We're seeing historic droughts all over the world. Another, consequence of the climate catastrophe that we have created. And we have one more for you. This one's in the New York Times. It's by April Rubin. The latest find as water levels fall. Dinosaur tracks in Texas. Look at how they present this, you guys. Look at how they present this. It's a fucking drought, and they're like, we found some dinosaur footprints. Now, I grant you, that's kind of cool. That belongs further in the article than major drought. Anyhow, as a punishing drought grips parts of the world this summer, bodies of water have been drying up, exposing submerged World War II relics in Europe, several sets of human lakes in Lake Mead outside Las Vegas, and even an entire village in Spain. The latest find as water levels fall, dinosaur tracks in Texas. You guys just read that paragraph back to yourself, and again, it's cool. You guys go study the dinosaur tracks. I hope scientists are all over that, right? But you're talking about a fucking historic drought all over the world, and you just casually list off all of these places that are going dry before talking about what you really wanted to get to, which was dinosaur tracks. I just think that's absolutely absurd. So shame on the New York Times for that, but I just wanted to bring it up to point out we're seeing these historic droughts in Africa, in China, in Texas, in Nevada, all over the place, and it is one of the many results of the climate catastrophe. This in The Lever, it's by Ricardo Gomez. You love to see it. I told you guys I had a slightly positive story to finish out this climate segment with. A clean energy future might not be far away. Also, California to ban gas-powered cars. The country's first freshwater wind farm gets back on track, and scientists discover a process to destroy forever chemicals. Good things are happening. A new renewable energy study sets the record straight. Switching to 100% renewable energy is far more attainable than imagined and could immediately reduce energy prices. Also, California will ban the sale of new gas-powered vehicles by 2035. By the way, I don't know if it's my city or my state, but they're doing the same thing, 2035. I know that's a ways down the road, and again, there's a lot to condemn there, but, banning the sale of gas-powered cars, I think, is obviously a necessary thing considering the direction that we are headed. The U.S.'s first freshwater wind farm will finally get built, and scientists discover a process of destroying forever chemicals. All this and much more in this week's edition of You Love to See It. So, I just wanted to point out there are some good things that are happening in the climate world, and I hope that we will continue to make scientific advancements to try to address this catastrophe, but obviously the most important thing is to pursue avenues via public policy to actually address the cause of the problem, right? What's the saying? If you want to, if you're digging a hole and you want to fill it in, the first thing you got to do is stop fucking digging. So that's what we need to do first, and then we need to figure out how we're going to dig ourselves out of the hole that we have already created. So I just, I found it inspiring that there are at least a few. I feel like every time I cover this, I always mention, this is always such a dark topic. There's never anything positive when I talk about the climate. So I was grateful to find one piece that was somewhat positive, and I hope you all will continue to make noise about this issue and push in whatever ways you can for a more sustainable future and, public policies that actually seek to address this catastrophe that we have created. All right. We have a clip here. I'm sure a number of you followed the Mehmet Oz and John Fetterman campaign for the Senate seat in Pennsylvania. Oz, obviously a TV doctor, and he made much of his $100 million fortune as a snake oil salesman. More Perfect Union did a wonderful job breaking this down, so I'm going to show you this video courtesy of More Perfect Union about Dr. Oz and how he attained his fortune.
Shouldn't sell products. You wouldn't trust me if you came to me for advice and I said, take my version of a solving cream here. It just doesn't sound and feel right to me.
I'll show you one that I like a lot. Our trusted sponsorship partner, USANA Health Sciences, makes a product called Hepisil. In addition to the magnesium with 20% off, what else can you find on the iHerb website?
Over 30,000 health and wellness products.
A magic weight loss cure for every body type.
You buy it online.
Probiotics. Available in your local Walmart or on Walmart.com.
Pennsylvania Senate candidate Dr. Mehmet Oz built an incredibly lucrative career out of the trust in himself he cultivated with the American people. After all, he is
America's doctor, the one and only Dr. Oz.
Did I say incredibly lucrative career? I meant utterly, obscenely lucrative. A mandatory financial disclosure form showed Oz and his wife own at least $100 million in assets.
I'm excited to be featured on the cover of the newest issue of Success magazine. I don't know if you know, but if you ever go on safari, the elephants, that's $20 for crudité, and this doesn't include the tequila. And we got Joe Biden to thank for this.
And now, like that other rich TV pitchman, he wants to go to Washington.
I endorsed another person today, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania.
I'm a son of an immigrant. I believe in the American dream because I lived it myself.
But how much does he really get it? The average yearly income in Pennsylvania is $35,000. Dr. Oz made nearly 4 times that doing one speech for the Pistachio Growers Association.
One of the elegant aspects of pistachios in particular is that you can eat quite a few. You can pluck them, plop them, plop them.
We dug through pages and pages of campaign finance documents, corporate filings, policy statements, news archives, internal corporate documents, and way too many hours of the Dr. Oz show. There's a pattern there. America's doctor enriching himself by selling out working people and their trust in him to the highest bidder. And that has far-reaching ramifications for the American worker. So let's dig in. Oz built a lot of trust early in his career, a hotshot Ivy League doctor performing high-profile surgeries at one of the most respected hospitals in the country. Then one of the most liked people in America put him on TV and deemed him America's doctor. His show created the Oz effect. That's when Oz recommends an ingredient, food, or cure, and sales noticeably go up.
Sea buckthorn. It is the new miracle berry. The diet aid is sage leaf tea.
But there was a problem with the claims. They weren't really scientific. It led to Oz testifying on the Senate floor in 2014. During his testimony, Oz eventually admitted.
The items that I talk about in the show, I passionately study them. I recognize that oftentimes they don't have the scientific muster to present as fact.
A study later that year found that fewer than half of Oz's recommendations had any scientific confirmation, and 15% have been proven completely wrong. Oz spent the next 8 years and 1,200 episodes shilling more stuff. Just being on TV is lucrative. By 2021, his host salary was $2 million, but he also got $200,000 for producing the show, hundreds of thousands more for consulting with his own production companies, and $7 million in gains from owning those production companies. But Oz also made money using his show to push products by what he calls trusted partners. Translation, the companies that pay him to shill them, like USANA, a multi-level marketing company.
USANA is one of the trusted sponsorship partners of the show, and their Essentials product contains ingredients designed to nourish, protect, and renew your body's cells.
Internal company documents, like this one, implore distributors to use Dr. Oz to sell and upsell products and bring more people into the suspiciously pyramid-shaped scheme. Oz's financial disclosure doesn't show how much USANA paid, but the very existence of the deal shows that it's not hard to buy Dr. Oz's word. Oz also launched his own healthcare product, ShareCare, an app for connecting patients with doctors and medical advice. Fierce Pharma, an industry trade publication, gushed over the brilliance of ShareCare. ShareCare specifically works with pharma companies to create custom marketing programs. One campaign educated arthritis patients about a branded treatment and resulted in almost 20% of those targeted visiting their doctor and discussing the brand. Because people trusted Dr. Oz, they trusted this app to give them health advice. What it gave them were advertisements. And the platform knew what drug users might need because it was spying on them. One of the key offerings ShareCare has for pharma, data, and lots of it. Consumers answer more than 100 questions when they join the platform. This after Oz promised,
allowing patients to truly own their own data.
Oz has already made millions on ShareCare and still owns a large portion of the company. I know they say sharing is caring, but it doesn't exactly seem like Oz cares. And those are only the more egregious examples. It was constant. Trusted partners included elder care companies, pharmacies, eczema creams, fiber supplements, and products by a company Oz still owns stock in, Pantherix.
This is something I think you ought to have on hand, period. You don't want to run to this store when you have diarrhea. So where do you find Diet Rescue? Available in your local Walmart.
Which brings us to today. Dr. Oz is an incredibly wealthy man, having sold the American people's trust in him for $100 million. And he's turning to that trust again.
I'm Dr. Oz, and I approve this message.
He even does the exact same smile from when he was shilling probiotics for Walmart. And yet, despite all of the corporate shilling, despite getting rich off of his miracle cures that didn't work, still Oz keeps up the whole working class shtick.
I'm a son of an immigrant. I respect the needs of workers hurt by regulations and overreaching government.
That quote is really telling. Oz wants working people to think that it's regulations that are keeping working Pennsylvanians down. That says a lot about who he really speaks for. As a candidate, when he talks about working class issues, he generally takes the side of bosses.
Flinchie's was forced to shut down on Mondays because people, they don't want to work.
Like this pizza shop owner not paying his drivers well enough to afford gas.
Every time they deliver pizzas, they make $100, they gotta put $100 into their car.
Or the visit he made to a factory floor for a TikTok at a company that was sued last year for wage theft, not paying employees for the time that they spent suiting up to deal with dangerous chemicals. And what does he think of unions? He spread a conspiracy theory that teachers' unions were colluding with the CDC to keep schools closed.
That Federal Teachers Union insight is very damaging. It shows that the CDC was actually taking insights and changing its guidance based on what the federal teachers unions were saying.
What is he even accusing the teachers union of? A dastardly plan to keep their workers safe? And if you can't find work or otherwise unemployed, Oz thinks it's because you smoke too much weed.
You know, there are not enough Pennsylvanians to work in Pennsylvania. Giving them pot so they stay home is not, I don't think, an ideal move.
Perhaps Oz is more likely to support bosses than working people because that's who he spends his time with. On mandatory financial disclosure forms, Oz and his wife reported $100 million in assets, trust funds, businesses, stock, a cattle farm, and homes in Turkey, New York, New Jersey, and Palm Beach, Florida. Palm Beach is one of the richest zip codes in America, dotted with extravagant mansions. Oz is heavily invested in Palm Beach society. He's a sitting director on the board of the Palm Beach Civic Association and even lent them his shilling skills for a $350 lunch.
Are we talking about how to live the good life?
Oz loves Palm Beach, and Palm Beach really loves Oz. FEC documents show dozens of massive donations to Oz's campaign and super PAC from the Palm Beach zip code, which is 1,000 miles away from Pennsylvania. You know, the state where Oz is running for Senate. But Palm Beach donors are just the beginning. We know about the trusted partners of Oz's TV doctor career, the sponsors Oz sold working Americans out to. So who are the trusted partners of Oz's political career? Some of the top donors to Oz's super PAC, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars here, are Gerald Lamole, his stepfather, John Mack, the former Morgan Stanley CEO, whose involvement in the 2008 financial crisis was immortalized by Tony Shalhoub in Too Big to Fail.
Buying toxic assets. Wasn't that the idea?
John Childs, a private equity billionaire who was pushed out of his firm after he was charged in a massive parlor human trafficking bust. And a mysterious corporation, Bison Valley LLC, formed within weeks of Oz announcing his campaign. It's impossible to see who's behind the company because it was created by a law firm specializing in legal and non-legal wealth preservation to the high net worth. Because, of course it is. But what can we learn about actual policy from this list? Let's dig deeper, like this $100,000 donation from Terry LaCour of LaCour Enterprises. LaCour donates to a lot of Republicans, but this year his biggest donation by far was to Oz. LaCour Enterprises, like Oz's old favorite USANA, is heavily involved in multi-level marketing. So is SGII Inc., Senegence, whose executives also made several large Oz donations. Senegence is a member of the Direct Selling Association, the industry group for MLMs. Days after Oz won his primary, he gave the keynote speech at the CEO breakfast for the industry group, and he's been going to their events for years. The association lobbied against the PRO Act because it would have extended NLRB protection, the right to organize and unionize, to far more workers, like their distributors. But it's not just MLMs. The Direct Selling Association is part of a coalition of companies and trade groups supporting the deceptively named Worker Flexibility and Choice Act. It would narrow the definition of employee so far more workers would be independent contractors, meaning fewer rights in the workplace. Worker misclassification, that's when an employee is wrongly sorted as an independent contractor so that they lose protections, is already a huge problem for working people in Pennsylvania. The state's Worker Misclassification Task Force found 50,000 employers misclassify at least one employee, totaling $176 million in stolen medical coverage and lost wages. Oz hasn't made any public statement on worker classification, and his campaign didn't respond to requests for comment. But if you look at the industries and organizations who endorse anti-worker bills, there is a lot of crossover with Oz's donor list. And remember what Oz said about helping workers.
Workers hurt by regulations.
Those regulations are there to protect workers. Oz is truly an amazing pitchman. He builds trust and then takes advantage. Working people in Pennsylvania need to make sure that they don't fall for it.
Great clip there, courtesy of More Perfect Union. Once again, at More Perfect US if you're not already following them. Obviously, Dr. Oz is a complete and total fraud. And, you know, I think there's a lot of imperfect things about Fetterman, too. So I'm not, you know, altogether excited about the race in general. But I do think Fetterman is on a number of important issues left of the Democratic Party, which is pretty low bar. But nonetheless, I think he would be better than most senators, and I think he has a very good chance of beating Oz, not just because he's running a pretty good campaign and seems to actually know how to use Twitter. He must have some aides that actually understand how to campaign on Twitter, but because Oz is just absolutely tanking his own campaign. The crudité thing, you guys, we're going to be referencing that for decades. Like, that was... In 20 years, we're going to be saying that was your crudité moment to a candidate who blows his campaign. For a while, it was the Dukakis moment, right? You guys remember this with in the tank with the helmet on, and everyone says that killed his campaign. The crudité thing, I think, is going to be the new version of that. I think going forward, we'll say you had your crudité moment, not your Dukakis moment. So Oz, it's been very comedic. I will say, like, I appreciate this campaign for just literally for the laughs that it's brought me in recent weeks. So thanks to Oz for that. But I thought that video was very well done and wanted to make sure to reveal to you guys just how fraudulent of a human being Mehmet Oz actually is, and why he obviously has absolutely no business representing the state of Pennsylvania. So this one is funny. I'm sure a number of you saw this. George W. Bush teaches authentic leadership, a masterclass. George W. Bush, you guys. For me, obviously you could go the moral route and be like, we probably shouldn't have fucking lying war criminals teaching master classes on leadership. You could go that route. For me, it's almost even more like the dude was literally Dick Cheney's puppet, and you're going to call him a leader. A leader. More than any other president in modern history, he conceded the president to his vice president. And you're going to call him a leader. A leader. He's the fail son of the Bush family. Fell ass backwards into the presidency. Never would have been governor or president if it weren't for the last name that he had. You're going to call him a leader and have him teach a class. The rehabilitation of George W. Bush and these characters, we talked about Liz Cheney recently, is absurd. It is absurd. And it's all due to this very disturbing trend of Trump being the dividing line and sort of dictating all politics. If you oppose, and it's not even just Trump, you guys, it's like stop the steal and January 6th. If you think January 6th was bad and you oppose stop the steal, then you're in good camp. Even if you're a fucking war criminal who started the war in Iraq, you know, it stumbled his way through Katrina and on and on and on. One of the worst, this is really a high bar, you guys. George W. Bush is one of the worst presidents of the modern era. That's a tremendously high bar, but he's right there. And the Democrats rehabilitate him because he says a few things bad about Trump. He makes the right noises about January 6th. Now he's teaching a fucking masterclass on leadership. I don't even know where to start, you guys. The guy couldn't say a sentence at a press conference. You're going to have him teach a class on leadership. I mean, part of me is internally laughing so hard that I'm crying, and then part of me is deeply angry that we live in a society that will rehabilitate a human being like this. So I don't know how to quite feel about this story, but I couldn't help but talk about that. Just, you know, that feels like satire, and it just very revealing about the society that we live in. in a whole number of different ways. You do not, in fact, you guys, have to rehabilitate the worst people on the planet simply because they said January 6th was bad. Just FYI. All right. Brian Stelter, who hosted Reliable Sources on CNN for years, has been fired. We've kind of kept up on the CNN stories over the recent months that they were trying to change course based upon new management. Obviously, Zucker was there forever, and apparently Stelter and Zucker were very close friends, and that's probably part of why Stelter got to keep his job for so long, even though he is just an objectively terrible presenter, right? You guys might love or hate certain aspects of me or other commentators, how we present, what we have to say, what we focus on, any of that. What I mean about Stelter is he is simply not good at keeping people watching. He is simply not good at presenting the news. He is not compelling. He has nothing to say except for defense of the establishment media at every turn, even though he's supposed to be a media critic. He is completely uninteresting. He's milquetoast. There's just nothing about Stelter that in my view, warranted the position he was in. Might be a super nice, personable human being, but he did not deserve that job, and he finally lost it because his friend is no longer at the helm at CNN. Anyway, Stelter did this whole sign-off, his last show, where he portrayed himself like the little guy that fought back against the big bad establishment, right? Dude, you work for CNN. You work for one of the biggest media institutions in the fucking world. Not just the country, the world. You go to an airport almost anywhere, what's on the fucking TV? You work for them, and you're portraying yourself as this little guy that could. I mean, it was just so absurd and sad and pitiful. Anyway, and he thanked the viewers, and then he said Reliable Sources has been one of the most popular shows in one of the least popular time slots. I mean, he just made a complete and total fool of himself, humiliated himself thoroughly on his sign-off. I couldn't find that clip for whatever reason to in a format that I could download and show to you guys, but it was pretty... It was, vicarious embarrassment kind of a thing watching that clip. I do want to bring you guys a different clip that I always think of when I think of Brian Stelter, and that is Michael Wolff, who's kind of a clown show in and of himself. He wrote an anti-Trump book. But Michael Wolff, to his credit in this clip, is very honest and goes right after Stelter about his impact on the narratives and the discourse in politics, and also admits why he's actually coming on cable news. So I thought this was a very funny clip that is from a while ago, but I wanted to bring you guys this clip in lieu of Stelter being fired.
And that's what Trump does. He has spent most of his administration seeing people on television and immediately calling them.
But maybe that's how it works sometimes,
I don't want you to think...
Is that how it works? That's how you get access?
But I don't want you to think that what I said at that point was in any way inauthentic. I think the media has done a terrible job on this. I think you yourself, while you're a nice guy, you're full of sanctimony. You become part of one of the parts of the problem of the media. You come on here and you have a monopoly on truth. You know exactly how things are supposed to be done. You are one of the reasons people can't stand the media. Sorry.
You're cracking me up.
It's your fault.
So what should I do differently, Michael?
Don't talk so much. Listen more. People have genuine problems with the media. The media doesn't get the story right. The media exists in its own bubble.
That's true. I agree.
You got to stop. I mean, that last segment that I just had to listen to of all of the people saying the same old stuff. Also, you're incredibly repetitive. It's week after week. I mean, you're the flip side of Donald Trump. Fake news, and you say virtuous news.
We just figure out what is real.
I mean,
I'm listening.
Well, figuring out what is real is not so easy, and you know, most people don't want to turn to Brian Stelter to tell us what's real. I'm sorry.
Well, then why'd you bother coming on CNN a few times this week?
You know, I'm a book salesman.
Michael, I love talking to you. I'm grateful you came on. And I guess let's do it again in 4 years. Thanks.
Can you even imagine being so thoroughly undressed on national television by a guest that you brought on your own show? Oh, God. And every time he comes back with some sort of, oh, yeah, I agree with that. You know, oh, let's have you back on. Oh, God. So humiliating. That's like Brian Stelter's career, you know, in a clip. That is really enigmatic of his whole, or emblematic, excuse me, of his whole fucking career. And then at the end, Wolf's just like, I'm a book salesman. I'm here to sell books. I mean, I kind of appreciate the honesty, right? Anyway, Brian Stelter gone at CNN. You know, I thought that was kind of worth covering because he's been sort of a prominent piece of the establishment media for a long time. There are these certain shows, you guys, like Morning Joe's, another one of these, where regular people do not watch it, but all of the DC elites watch it. And I think Stelter, to some degree, was one of those, because all he did was kiss the ass of the establishment press and defend everything that they did, despite, again, you guys being CNN's quote-unquote media critic. Anyway, so I have a clip I want to show you guys here that is James Lee, who's doing a partnership now with Breaking Points. He did a segment on stock buybacks, how they work, and why they are sort of absurd and harmful, well, beneficial for the shareholders and executives, but harmful for the economy as a whole. So I thought this was a really fantastic segment. I want to make sure to show you guys this. This is James Lee talking about stock buybacks.
My name is James Lee. Welcome to another segment of 5149 on Breaking Points, where we dive into different topics at the intersection of business, politics, and society. And today I want to talk about stock buybacks, otherwise known as share repurchases. We hear a lot about it, so I want to take a few minutes today to dive deep into what it is, the common talking points, separating fact from fiction, recent policy changes, and the prolonged impact stock buybacks have on not only the individual companies engaging in that practice, but also on the overall health of the economy and society in general.
The debate around stock buybacks has to do with how companies use their cash. They have access to quite a bit of it right now. The tax cuts in 2017, relatively high earnings, and low interest rates have all added to corporate cash stockpiles. When a company is flush, it has options for what to do with its money. It can buy other companies, it can spend on research and development, it can buy new equipment, buildings, or technologies, or it can return money to shareholders. This can take the form of dividends or stock buybacks. In the past 10 years, the top 20 companies on the S&P 500 bought back about $1.3 trillion in shares, with Apple leading the way by far. In a stock buyback, a company purchases its own shares from shareholders and it takes them off the market, leaving fewer shares outstanding. This changes the math on the remaining shares in a key way. It boosts a metric called earnings per share, or EPS. The most basic equation for EPS is the company's net income divided by the number of outstanding shares. So when this number shrinks, the EPS rises. So if a company has a net income of $1,000 and has 100 shares outstanding, its EPS is $10. But if it buys back 10 of those shares, the EPS rises to $11.11. Higher per share earnings make stocks look good.
Making stocks look good. That really is the only ubiquitous North Star that drives American businesses. According to Reuters reporting from earlier this year, U.S. buybacks are at record highs. New repurchase announcements by U.S. companies reached over $300 billion in the first quarter of 2022, meaning that companies are on pace to buy back more than $1 trillion worth of their own shares this year. Compared to previous years, S&P 500 companies plowed around $880 billion into buying their own shares last year, up from $520 billion in 2020, according to S&P Dow Jones indices. Like the Wall Street Journal clip covered earlier, this is cash that companies could have used to expand their operations, spend on R&D and CapEx, dare I say, invest in their workforce, but they chose it to artificially inflate their earnings per share. Now, what's the issue here? Why should we be the ones to tell corporations and corporate executives how to spend their money? They are, after all, the experts in capital allocation, are they not?
Buybacks are an extremely important part of capital allocation across our economy. Buybacks are an extremely efficient way to reallocate capital. And nimble capital in America is what has driven our response to COVID. It is what has driven growth over time in combination with nimble labor, in combination with tech, education, healthcare. It's made America what it is.
Okay, a lot to unpack there from Mr. Jay Clayton, former chairman of the SEC. He talks about nimble capital driving a response to COVID. What I observed was the Federal Reserve jumping in to save big business by injecting more than $1.5 trillion into the market in March of 2020. He also talks about nimble labor, which basically refers to a company's ability to adjust their workforce up and down based on market demands. But what I saw was airlines and other businesses taking government bailout money that was supposed to go to preventing mass layoffs, and then exploiting a loophole to lay off the workers anyway. He talks about how buybacks are a, quote, extremely efficient way to reallocate capital. But if we look at what actually transpired in the days and months after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, companies across many sectors, profitable companies, requested government bailouts because for years and years, they had spent all of their cash buying back their own stocks. Here's the New York Times in April of 2020. Last month, the top executives of KFC, Wendy's, Papa John's, and other large restaurant chains held an urgent call with President Trump about the coronavirus crisis. The companies needed billions of dollars in aid to avoid mass layoffs, the executive said. The next day, their trade group asked government leaders, including Mr. Trump, for $145 billion in relief. These companies had been highly profitable in recent years, yet they were seeking help from the federal government. Where had all their money gone? Like much of corporate America, the restaurant chains had spent a large chunk on buying back their own stock, a practice aimed at bolstering its price. I just want to say, if people like you and I did something like this, spent money with reckless abandon on luxuries, let's say a high-end car or a yacht to make us look richer than we are, and then went bankrupt, we would be roasted to no end. But these folks, the corporate and political elites, have no problems bashing welfare for the people, while at the same time fully supporting corporate welfare, because that's exactly what this is. Companies misusing their cash to make them look more valuable than they are, and then when the going gets tough, hoping to be saved by government handouts. So I completely reject the notion that stock buybacks and repurchases are an extremely efficient way to reallocate capital, or even a great way to reward shareholders, because let's say we were to entertain the shareholder primacy theory for a second, that corporations are to prioritize shareholder return above all other considerations. Stock buybacks aren't even necessarily the best way to do it.
The reality is, for share buybacks, you reward the people who are leaving and selling your stock instead of rewarding the people who are keeping your stock, right?
But that goes to the whole skin in the game thing, right? Don't people want skin in the game? Don't we want them to have skin in the game?
Yeah, the problem is that it's really easy to financial engineer with stock buybacks, right? There's just so many games that you can play, and it just creates a whole different set of problems. I think the fundamental issue is, do you want to reward your shareholders for staying via dividends? Wouldn't you want more people who are typically not shareholders to come in and own the shares of your stock?
Right, without getting too technical, the point Mark Cuban is trying to make here is that there are two primary ways to redistribute a company's earnings back to the shareholders, one via a stock buyback and the other via dividends. The former provides a short-term boost to the stock price, but can be manipulated easily by executives and company insiders. And the latter is usually a quarterly distribution to shareholders that reward, in theory, long-term investors for holding on to a company's shares. So if it's not the best way, why are stock buybacks oftentimes the preferred method of earnings redistribution? Well, according to a 2019 paper published by the Roosevelt Institute that analyzed transactional data of non-financial corporations with publicly traded stock from 2005 to 2017, the researchers found that net insider sales of over $100,000 are more than twice as common in quarters when stock buybacks are also occurring than in non-buyback quarters, and that in quarters with net insider sales, buybacks are more than twice as common as in quarters without net insider sales. Meaning that senior corporate executives and other company insiders were personally enriching themselves above and beyond retail investors and other shareholders by timing their stock trades based on when these buybacks were happening, which of course they decide, with their gains coming at the expense of employees and other stakeholders. And more importantly, this paper also shows that this type of behavior isn't a one-off occurrence, but rather evidence of corporate cronyism at a systemic level. Another study conducted in 2017 by Robert Aries and Michael Olenek, professors at INSEAD, a top global business school, examined 1,839 public companies in the United States over a 5-year time scale and found that the more money a firm spends on buybacks, the less likely it is to grow over the long term. The chart on your screen shows that not only do stock buybacks not lead to a growth in a company's market value, they are actually strongly correlated to a declining market value. Those findings, to me, are not all that surprising. It's an indisputable fact that any money spent on a buyback, of course, can't be invested elsewhere in the company. But what makes this worse and far more dangerous for the overall health of the economy is that, fine, if you want to take on additional risk by using your company's free cash flow to buy back your own shares, okay, fine, that's up to you. But that's not what's actually happening in a majority of these cases. This is an alarming headline from Fortune magazine. More than half of all stock buybacks are now financed by debt. So it's not just that corporations are spending their own money to financially engineer metrics that make them appear more valuable than they actually are. They are borrowing money to do so, which is extremely precarious given the scale and prevalence of buybacks, like we talked about, on pace for over $1 trillion this year, right? It's one thing if a company takes on debt to finance investments in potential future productive capabilities like new facilities or R&D, but taking on debt to finance buybacks, which gives you zero revenue generating contributions that can help pay off this debt in the future, means that companies engaging in this practice are exposing themselves to a lot more financial risk in the long run. From the Harvard Business Review, quote, "Whether it is corporate debt or government debt that funds additional buybacks, it is the underlying problem of the corporate obsession with stock price performance that makes U.S. households more vulnerable to the boom and bust economy. Debt-financed buybacks reinforce financial fragility, but it is stock buybacks, however funded, that undermine the quest for equitable and stable economic growth." So yeah, buybacks have far-reaching negative implications for economic and societal stability. So let's take a moment to discuss recent policy changes addressing the issue of stock buybacks. Within the Inflation Reduction Act that has just been signed into law, there is a new 1% excise tax on corporate stock buybacks, presumably to rein in corporations and disincentivize them from engaging in this practice. Now, how does Wall Street feel about this?
The future of stock buybacks in focus today on word Democrats appear poised to pass their Inflation Reduction Act, which includes a new 1% excise tax on that practice. The question is whether it will, in fact, have a material impact or not, and what that might mean for stocks.
I don't really think it's a big deal. 1% buyback tax is about less than 0.5% to S&P 500 earnings, number one. I just don't think it's big enough for companies to change their strategy, and they're generating so much free cash flow, they do want to return it to shareholders. I think on the margin, maybe they shift incrementally to more dividends versus buybacks, but I don't think this is going to be material.
Interesting. The 1% tax is immaterial. Doesn't matter. You see, the thing we have to understand is that in this era of American politics, where there is an unlimited sum of money freely flowing back and forth between the government and the private sector, there are no laws on the books that aren't endorsed by the corporate elite. It may not be exactly what they want. In this instance, I'm certain that they would prefer no tax at all, but given the current climate and political sentiment, they can live with the 1%. In fact, it might even benefit them in the long run. David Dayen, in some great reporting, highlights this exact point in the American Prospect. Quote, "The bigger problem is that the excise tax cuts the government in on the buyback scam. Not only will shareholders and executives continue to benefit over workers and capital investment, but so will the U.S. Treasury. Henceforth, if you try to limit buybacks, which the Biden administration proposed in its 2023 budget, that will cost the government money. If you try to ban them, which the SEC could do simply by removing the safe harbor put in place in 1982 that effectively decriminalized the practice, that would cost the government even more." So I don't think it's an accident at all that the Inflation Reduction Act is riddled with corporate loopholes and handouts. It's corporate welfare in disguise. There is nothing in there that Wall Street can't live with. And if it's something they absolutely don't want to live with, it's 100% gone, a la the last minute removal of the carried interest tax provision. The point I'm trying to make is, don't be confused by the free market. There is always somebody making up the rules to the game. Senior corporate executives will forever be incentivized to enrich themselves and their shareholders without regard for their employees or society in general, and buybacks are a great example of this. Great for corporate insiders, but bad for everyone else. And if we acknowledge that there is maybe more to America than allowing a small group of people to make as much money as possible, then it's up to us, no matter how critical or skeptical we are of government power, to force our elected public servants to create rules and guardrails that decentralize power and put it back in the hands of the American people. That's it for me today. I hope you found this segment about stock buybacks to be helpful and informative. If you enjoyed it, I would encourage you to head on over and subscribe to my YouTube channel, 5149 with James Lee, where I make videos on topics related to business, politics, society. The link will be in the description below. Thank you for tuning in to Breaking Points, and as always, I appreciate your time.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to...
Okay, wonderful breakdown there from James. There are two things that really stood out to me. First of all, I very much appreciate him just kind of going in depth about what stock buybacks actually are and the effect. He brought up charts and evidence, what they actually do. Not even good long-term business for the business engaging in the buybacks, let alone for the rest of us. There were 2 points that really stood out to me. First, I love that analogy of someone has to make the rules to the game that he mentioned at the end there. When if you think about the economy as a market, who is setting the rules for that market? That is why the corruption exists on the by and large, because interests who have a lot to gain or lose by way of capital are going to find a way to buy off the person who is writing or people who are writing the rules. They want to win the game, so they're going to buy off the official, right? I love that analogy, and I think that's a really important way to look at it's a lot of this corruption and why it's there to start with. The second thing, he mentioned that in the long term, that 1% excise tax might actually benefit them. And what he was kind of trying to say is, because we misunderstand federal finance and we think that the government must be funded by tax dollars, if they ever actually go to ban stock buybacks, that will mean a hit to the tax revenue that the government is taking in, because they will be banning an activity that they're making a large sum of taxes on. So the misunderstanding of federal finance that we talk about a lot at Real Progressives and that a lot of MMTers are so focused on really does sort of like find its way into all of these different aspects of our political discourse. And that, from James, I thought was a very brilliant point. That, of course, if you're the banks, you're willing to pay a very small fee if you think it's going to make the government substantially less likely to take further action. And in a roundabout way, because so many people so misunderstand how the federal government is actually financed, there will be those arguing we can't ban stock buybacks because we're making X billion in taxes off of the stock buybacks. So fantastic point there. I think that is a very good example of how the sausage is made in D.C. And a wonderful breakdown there on stock buybacks from James Lee. Encourage you all to go check out his channel, 5149. I'm not familiar with him. I didn't know who he was until I saw him on Breaking Points there, but wonderful breakdown there, and I wanted to make sure to bring you all that clip. So we do have an update on the Breonna Taylor story. I'm sure you guys remember Breonna Taylor was killed in an illegal no-knock raid by officers who thought that a drug dealer was in her apartment, or, you know, at first I had heard they thought they got the apartment wrong and it was supposed to be her neighbor, and they tried to arrest her boyfriend, who shot back because these people just burst into their apartment. It was an example in a whole number of ways of why we should not have no-knock raids, period. And then I should just kind of set the pretext here before I bring up the update. As I've covered before, Daniel Cameron, who's Attorney General in Kentucky there, basically refused to actually try to get an indictment against the officers when he presented the case for a grand jury, which resulted in no indictment for the officers who murdered Breonna Taylor. And that was where things sat for a very long time, but we do now have an update here. This is a tweet from the New York Times. A former detective admitting to helping mislead a judge into authorizing the raid of Breonna Taylor's apartment that led to her killing. She admitted to working with another officer to falsify a search warrant application and lying to cover up their act. And they have the screenshot of the piece there. Kelly Goodlett, the former detective, pleaded guilty to one count of conspiracy. She is the first officer to be convicted in the fatal police operation. Guys, the reason I wanted to bring this up, this is a lot more common than you think. It's a lot more common than you think. It's another reason that we should ban no-knock raids. And, you know, I guess there's a part of me that, like, I think part of the reason that George Floyd is sort of moved a lot of people who had previously been immovable on the issues of police and the justice system is because of just how egregious the case was, right? Like, the opportunities that he had not to kill George were so ample. And when people saw that, I think that sort of viscerally, like, how can you not change your mind, right? So I think a lot of people who previously were, you know, maybe not like pro-police, but we're certainly not in favor of defunding police and like serious reforms, you know, rebuilding the institution, you know, addressing all of the racist, classist elements of our justice system. People who would push back against progressive proposals on those issues, some of them really were moved by George Floyd's murder. And I kind of thought Breonna Taylor would be a similar case. And perhaps you could argue it is, and it's just kind of this wave of a movement gaining steam, and these were each instances that contributed. But the fact that Chauvin was charged, convicted, and thrown in jail in a very public way, and these 4 officers got off, it might have been 3. I think it was 4 officers, though. Someone can correct me in the chat. I think it was 4 officers. The fact that they all got off without any punishment or consequence at all seemed well beyond the pale to me. So I'm glad to see that there is at least a consequence here for the officer who falsified information in approving the search warrant, or on the request for the search warrant. And I hope that this will lead to further scrutiny about the process by which these warrants are obtained and about no-knock raids in general. So that's a positive development, and I hope that the officers who actually murdered her will be, coming up shortly in terms of their punishment. So I have a short little clip here I wanted to show you guys about. It's Noam Chomsky on Useful Idiots, which is Katie Halper and Aaron Mate. And Noam is talking about the media coverage of Ukraine. And this clip has rustled quite a few feathers, as Noam kind of tends to do when he talks about these kinds of things. But I thought this was a really important point, and it really is drawing on a lot of his work, manufacturing consent and that kind of thing. So I'll show you guys this clip, and we can come back and discuss.
You have media which encourage debate, looks as if it's open, lots of lively debate, within a narrow framework of presuppositions, which part of the propaganda system. You don't see them, you don't ask about them, you don't talk about them. They just set the frame in which you can talk. Some of them are so overt that they're almost comical. Like right now, if you're a respectable writer, you want to be right in the main journals, you talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have to call it the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's a very interesting phrase. It was never used before. You look back at the record, like in Iraq, which was totally unprovoked. Nobody ever called it the unprovoked invasion of Iraq. In fact, I don't know if the term was ever used. If it was very marginal. Now you look it up on Google and hundreds, thousands of hits. Every article comes out has to talk about the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Why? Because they know perfectly well it's provoked. It doesn't justify it, but it was massively provoked. Top U.S. diplomats have been talking about this for 30 years. Even the head of the CIA. Yes, it's provoked and it's crazy. It's reckless. Right-wing people like Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense under Bush, said, this is crazy what you're doing. It's reckless, provocative to invite Ukraine into NATO. No Russian leader will ever accept it. Massively provoked. So therefore, we have to call it the unprovoked invasion. I mean, any good shrink could tell you what's going on. It's not very profound. But the point is, a lot of it is just on the surface. Or like, what's the point of banning RT, for example? Like banning Chris Hedges.
So, yeah, obviously, pretty indisputable comments there from Noam Chomsky, and I think he's spot on. That point he made to start off is kind of the primary thesis of manufacturing consent, and I think it's really important for people to understand who might not have already heard this concept. Chomsky basically argues that the most effective way to constrain and control political discourse is to severely limit the spectrum of acceptable debate and then encourage people to have lively, visceral debate within that spectrum. So the propaganda has already happened, and now the people think that they have the freedom to have these debates. But they're operating within a framework that has already executed the propaganda. It's a little bit, to tie it back into the corruption story earlier, it's a little bit like how corporations constrain the political debate to an acceptable portion for them. And then even if they, within that spectrum, don't get the result that they want, they're still getting an acceptable result, right? So I think Chomsky's spot on in that analysis. And obviously with Ukraine, you guys, it's like, it's just so overt and so explicit and so right in front of your face, the way that this has been reported. You're not allowed in American media to have even a nuanced view about this conflict. Chomsky takes that nuanced view. He says he does not think the invasion was justified, but it was certainly provoked. And when he says things like that, American media just lose their ever-loving minds. And that should really tell you everything about their role and how they view their role in political discourse and in the creation of these narratives, or in the manufacturing consent from the public to continue with these forever wars, or in our case, continue to provide weapons and funding for these forever wars. So I just thought that was very interesting. I think Chomsky's spot on in his analysis of the American press, and I think you should always keep that sort of framework in mind when you are digesting media about foreign conflicts in particular. Really everything, but in particular foreign conflicts that have anything to do with one of our biggest enemies like Russia or Cuba or China or Iran or fill in the blank, right? You should always apply that grain of salt when you're reading any sort of press outlet that is friendly to the American government and reading about foreign stories. So wonderful job there from Chomsky and Katie and Aaron. And I wanted to make sure that I brought that to you guys. I think it's really, really, really important in the modern day to have an understanding of what the media's actual role is, what it's there to do, and how it functions. We also have a clip This is Daniel Levy at the UN Security Council talking about Israel-Palestine. And this is not the kind of thing that very often is said in these kinds of environments. So I wanted to make sure to bring you this wonderful job from Daniel Levy at the UN Security Council.
We know of certain developments that can at the same time be both politically uncomfortable but also politically salient. The increasingly weighty body of scholarly, legal, and public opinion that has designated Israel to be perpetrating apartheid in the territories under its control is just such a development. A designation made by Palestinian scholars and institutes, later examined and endorsed by Israeli human rights organizations led by B'Tselem, has now become the legal designation made by Human Rights Watch and this year by Amnesty International. This is what a failure to generate accountability and to achieve two states looks like. As uncomfortable as I know it is for some, I urge this chamber not to underestimate the longer-term significance and traction of what is happening. At the Human Rights Council meetings in Geneva this March, states speaking on behalf of the Africa Group, the Arab Group, and the OIC Group all referenced this apartheid situation. And it will come as little surprise if this echoes and resonates in parts of the world that have experienced apartheid and settler colonialism and that have gone through decolonization. It is a paradigm that will also bring the discrimination faced by Palestinians as citizens of Israel into sharper relief. It must be a wake-up call. 75 years.
You do not hear the term apartheid referenced very often in reference to what Israel is doing in the West Bank and Gaza. Obviously, that is exactly what is happening, and Daniel made that very clear in that clip. So that is an issue that is kind of just constant, and, you know, I think sometimes you guys, like, just to let you behind the curtain a little bit in terms of, like, planning for the show, I'm only on once a week, right? I would like to eventually be on a lot more often with you guys, but this is what my schedule allows for right now. So I have to pick, right? Even on days where I'm going to be up here for 3 or 4 hours, I got to pick stories. I can't do everything. And sometimes that can be a really, like, humbling and kind of painful process, because you almost feel like you're, like, throwing one story aside as though it's unimportant or meaningless, or, you know. And the reason I bring this up in with the Palestine thing is that there are so many instances where the United States is just engaging in morally reprehensible and deplorable things all over the world. And I wouldn't have grasped, or even I don't pretend to grasp, I wouldn't have even began to grasp the extent of it until I had to start picking and choosing each week. Like, you know, which couple foreign policy stories am I going to cover this week? And there's usually a whole bunch of them that are catastrophic. And, you know, Israel-Palestine is one of those that's just constant. The ethnic cleansing campaign, the illegal settlements, it is all horrific. The oppression of Palestinians, the out-and-out murder of them, the brutalization of those who dare to protest, the impact on their day-to-day lives with the checkpoints. I mean, I could just go on forever. It is catastrophic. And the fact that, like, what was it, about a year and a few months ago that we actually got a month or so of coverage on Israel-Palestine because the fighting had picked up a bit. The way the media just drops the issue when there's like a ceasefire or a temporary ceasefire, as though Palestinians are not still living under apartheid, is just disgusting. So I would love to see commentary like that a whole lot more often. at bodies like the UN Security Council and in the mainstream press, where it is largely disallowed to use that kind of language. So it is apartheid, it is ethnic cleansing, it is a crime against humanity, and it should be condemned universally. So great job there by Daniel Levy. Huge shout out for calling that out and doing so to a body that is not used to hearing it. And with that, you guys, I will call it a show. Once again, realprogressives.org for all of our fantastic content. realprogressives.org/donate if you would like to contribute. We are a nonprofit, and every little bit does help. All sorts of great content over there at realprogressives.org. We have articles, we have podcasts, we have other shows. Make sure you're not missing out on any of it. We're going to have an interview here coming up shortly with Jonathan Cadman, who is one of our writers, who has a fantastic piece up now at realprogressives.org. Go give that a read so you're ready for that interview. And make sure not to miss Steve's podcast, Macro and Cheese, on Saturdays, his Rogue Scholar clips throughout the week on this YouTube channel. Make sure you're subscribed to our other YouTube channel, Real Progressives, as well as Real Progress in Action. And it helps us out a whole lot, you guys, if you hit like, if you leave a comment, if you share it on social media or by word of mouth with your colleagues, your friends, your family, etc. Anything to help us combat the algorithms. Indie leftist commentators and news do not get a whole lot of love from the algorithms, so anything you can do to help is very much appreciated. Thank you so much for tuning in, you guys. I apologize for the late time again, hoping to get it back to that regular time of 5 Eastern next week. I hope you all have a fantastic week, and I will talk to you then.